Hi everybody. Welcome everybody to our meetup for this evening. Welcome to Francesco Strazzullo. It is
Hi.
our guest for this evening. Many thanks to him for being here. Just a quick presentation of us. We are the Ticino Softwarecraft meetup. And as you maybe already noticed, we adhere to the Software Crafter Manifesto. So this is a community for the ones that think that well is not good enough. We always try to challenge ourselves to raise the bar of our work. Just a quick note before we start with the Francesco talk for this evening. You can follow us on Twitter and on Meetup. And also stay tuned because after the Meetup, if you join the Kumo space that I linked here, and I will also add to the comment of this streaming, you will have the possibility to win a free JetBrains license. And also, Francesco was very kind with us, and he decided to give us give to the community as a gift a copy of his book that maybe he will talk about this later. And that's it. I think I could leave the word to Francesco. And thank you again for being here.
Okay. Giancarlo, can you share my screen? Okay, perfect. Thank you. And thank you very much for the introduction. And welcome everybody to this talk titled Domain-Driven Frontend. As you can imagine by the title, this talk is a quick introduction about a bunch of domain-driven design techniques applied to JavaScript front-end development, to single-page applications. But before I start showing you the code, talking about architecture and so on, I would like to introduce myself. And it's quite strange for me because usually I keep my presentation very short. And a former colleague of mine always suggests me to present me at the end of the presentation and at the beginning, because people should be focused on your topic and not on yourself. But this time, for this particular talk, I need to introduce myself because I need to explain a bit of my professional history, and this is useful to understand why I think that this talk is quite important, why this topic is quite important. So I'm Francesco Strazzullo. You can call me Stratz, it's my code name. Only two people in the world call me by my first name, Francesco. It's my wife and my mother, and both of them when they are very hungry. I am a partner and also a developer at Flowing. We are a software company, a remote-first software company based in Italy. But we have people all around from Italy, from north to south. If you want to talk about this talk, talk about my books, talk about other stuff with me, I strongly suggest you to follow me on Twitter, because it's the only social network that I use for work and talking about coding. The other social network I use just to talk about Italian politics. As you can imagine, it's not so interesting. So, okay, I started working with JavaScript with front-end applications in 2009. And before that, I worked for I think 7 years as a Java developer. Java enterprise developer, so Spring, Hibernate, Java server faces that kind of ecosystem. So you can imagine my difficulties when I have to shift my mindset from the very, very structured way of thinking of Java enterprise ecosystem to AngularJS, to, dynamic languages, a very, very strange architecture, and so on. After a while, I had to say that I stopped worrying about undefined and so on. I started to understand how JavaScript worked under the hood and what is the real power of JavaScript. But you may probably, you're thinking, why are you telling me this? Why I should care about your professional background and about the fact that you were a Java developer before becoming a JavaScript developer? And if I have to say everything, I started again working in Java and Kotlin from a couple of years ago. So today I'm quite a full stack developer. But why it's important? Well, it's important because I always kept a show in my backend background. Okay, so I kept learning, I kept reading books about domain-driven design in particular. This is the famous Blue Book of Eric Evans, the Angular stone of DDD, and the most practical but equally interesting implementing domain-driven design by Borg Vernon. So I had this kind of background while I was learning JavaScript, learning front-end architectures. Fast forward to 2015. This is a frame from one of the most famous JavaScript talk of the last decade, the last 10 years. This is the presentation of Redux made by Dan Abramov at React Europe 2015. As most of the front-end developers out there, when this talk was out and Redux was announced to the world, I literally felt happy, like the office crew that you can see in this slide. But after a while, after 6 months or so, or something like that, that I used this technique, this framework in production, in real projects, I just asked myself, wait a moment, this is just event sourcing for frontend. Because if you know Redux, you know that in Redux, everything is an event. Every change in the state of your application is made by propagating an event through some kind of event bus. It's very similar from an high-level point of view, of course, to event sourcing. But nobody was talking about these similarities, and nobody was talking about the Redux problems from an event sourcing point of view. A lot of people were talking about boilerplate, about too much indirection, but they are the same, exactly the same, kind of question that people have about event sourcing, but nobody was connecting the dots. Fast forward to today, to 2021, micro frontends is probably the next big thing. There are a lot of projects in production that use micro frontends today, and also module federation from Webpack. Also, there is some books that are out about micro frontends. But most of the time, when I read blog posts about micro frontends, nobody is connecting the dots with bounded context or microservices. They are just talking about the implementation, not about the principles that generated microservices and that, of course, generated micro frontends. So I came up with the revelation in my mind that the main problem here is that front-end community and DDD community don't talk each other very much. I've been a speaker at JS Day last week with this talk, and nobody was talking about DDD stuff. And I was an attendee in a lot of DDD conferences, and I listened to very, very few talks about JavaScript and front-end in general. So why I'm here at the end? My main purpose with this talk is to start talking about DDD to front-enders and vice versa. In this scenario, I imagine there are a lot of people that know DDD, and I want to show you how to implement some of the DDD techniques into a front-end application. One of the main problems with domain-driven design, when you start talking about domain-driven design, is that it's like, open a Pandora's box. There is a lot of stuff in when you talk about DDD. So you have the strategic domain-driven design. So you are talking about ubiquitous language, context mapping, core domain, subdomain, and storming by Brandolini or bounded context. Then you have the tactical principles of DDD that you need, and you need the tactical principle to put the strategic point of view into action. And they are entities, value objects, services, aggregates, and domain elements, and also other stuff. Okay, but this is the bulk of tactical domain-driven design. In my talk, I will concentrate with actual code on these 5 tactical domain-driven design techniques. Let me be clear with on one thing before I start showing the code. I'm not saying that everything that is applicable to DDD, it's also applicable to front-end development. Front-end development has a lot of particular kind of problems to solve, okay, that are specific to the front-end, to the fact that there is an actual user that is using the application. And in a backend ecosystem, you don't have a real user. You have a machine that invokes your machine, okay? And this simple fact leads to different problems to solve, but something it's quite applicable, and something it's already applied by most of front-end developers, but they don't know that they are using DDD. It's a problem of communication. As it's the first problem that we need to solve, and I want to solve it with this talk. So code is coming. All the code that you will see in a moment is hosted on Flowing's GitHub repository. So it's github.com, flowing.is, DDD frontend. And I will share with Ticino Softwarecraft after my talk so they can share it with you. And if you download the code, you will notice that every commit adds a little bit of information about the code base. It's just like a slide deck. So you can navigate the history, and with every commit, a new piece of information come over. So it should be quite easy to you to follow it after the talk. Last thing, before I start showing the code, it's a little disclaimer. I use JavaScript for this talk. I know it may seem stupid, but the main point is that I deliberately excluded TypeScript from my code base. And there are 2 reasons for this exclusion. There are 2 reasons for using JavaScript in this presentation. The first one is an historical point of view, because this talk, this code, is based on a real world problem that we solved in flowing. And it was about a huge refactoring of a very, very old front-end application built with Backbone, if I remember correctly. And we introduced some DDD techniques in order to reduce the amount of technical debt and start demolish the big ball of mud. And so I wanted to show that it's doable in also in existing application, so in legacy application, and so you don't need TypeScript to build DDD. The other one is from a trainer point of view. What I wanted to demonstrate when using JavaScript for this talk is that you don't need the classes, you don't need the types to implement a principle. You can create an entity, you can create a value object, you can create a repository using also a dynamic language, because I want people to concentrate when working on the front end, for example, on principles instead of types. I don't want now to create interfaces, abstract classes. I just want to create objects. And I want to demonstrate that just creating objects sometimes is enough to also implement complicated patterns and principles. So, code time now. Okay, before showing the code, let's show my application. The application is quite simple. It's just a list of employees from a company, okay, from an office, from a team. And you can just promote an employee to, I don't know, tech lead, senior developer, your choose. Just clicking on the heart icon, okay? Oh yeah, I want to promote Elena Ersner. Perfect. And that's it. This is all the UI that I want to show you. Also because I'm hopeful with CSS, so I just want to show code because I'm very, very bad with CSS and in designing a layout and something like that. So I will use a basic React application created with React Create App, okay, classical. And as you can see on the left, I have the code. On the right, I have a vocabulary of DDD. And this vocabulary will increment with the code. Every time that I add a concept to the code, I will also add it to my vocabulary, okay? This means that in the code that I will show you without any kind of commit, we already have entities and repositories. So let's start. We have a standard React application, so I just import my application. And my application uses an employee repository, as you can see here. Then what I do is that on the startup of the product of the application, I just call employees repository list. Then I wait for the response from the server, and then I just set the employees to the React state. Okay. If you don't know React, it's not a problem. You have just to understand that when I put data on the state, in this case, the employees are shown to the screen. Okay, that's it. Then I have a callback on the promote. So when I click on the heart icon, and what I do here is that I take the employees, the list of employees, and I map them, changing the selected employee to promoted true. So I change the state of that particular employee. Then I update the UI, setting the employees, and then I call my repository and I tell the server to promote my ID. And then if something happens, I just catch the error, I just do manage the error. It's quite simple. As you saw, I used the employees repository. Repository is the first topic about the DDD that I want to explain. A repository is just an object with the purpose of storing and retrieving entities. Its form should be independent from the data source. This is quite interesting for a front-end application because we use repositories all the time when we need to get, like in this case, data from a server. But we call APIs, we call services, these objects, I mean, not repository, but they are repository, just like the repository that we use in a DDD application. The most important part is the form should be independent from the data source. And while this part is quite easier in a standard DDD application, because you have interfaces, you have a lot of frameworks that create repositories. I think about Spring, for example, Spring Data. But what is the form that is independent from the data source in a front-end application? Well, the real common ground with all the kind of data source that you can have in a repository in a front-end application is that is asynchronous by default. Because if you don't know what is your data source or what will be your data source, but it will surely be asynchronous because you don't have data on the front-end application. Usually you have data, but they are a cache on local storage, but they are a copy of the data. If you want to be independent from the form, you should use always an asynchronous repository. In fact, I talked about waiting data from a server, but my repository is just a dummy repository created using Faker.js. Faker.js is a simple JavaScript library that create random data. So I create a random number, and I create an array with random sides with actually random data from ID, promoted, name, and so on. Then I return this data with a set timeout with a promise. In this case, what I achieved is that the form, the public contract of my repository is independent from the data source. Because I can have an API data source, I can have a socket data source, I can have an API data source, but I will always use a promise to communicate with my consumer. Like I said, the main purpose of a repository is to produce and store entities. So what is an entity? An entity is an object defined primarily by its identity that can change over time. When you're working with a front-end application, you are working with JSONs from a server, and the JSON is always, almost always, an entity because it have an ID. And we use that ID as an identity because, for example, we use the ID in the REST API URL. So it's the unique resource identifier. So probably it's a very, very good form of identity looking from the DDD's perspective. And this technique is used by every front-end developer out there to have the API calls in a dedicated file that produce JSONs, that produce data. But almost nobody talks about repositories and entities. So the first thing that I want to show you is that front-enders are already using DDD without knowing it. But let's go over. So let's go over. I want to go on with another commit. And this first commit, I added a simple business rule. The business rule is that in order to promote someone, you have to get all the peer reviews that you have from your colleagues. So you have, you get, reviews from your peers. Your peers give you a vote. The average of these votes should be higher than 7. This is my first business rule. So when it's lower, it just can promote the person, okay? How I implement that? In the app application, when I click on promote, what I do here is to take reviews from a server with review repository list. So I take the list of the reviews of the person that I want to promote. I calculate the average ranking. And if this average ranking is lower than the constant, if I remember correctly, is 7, then I launch an error. Otherwise, I continue with my flow. Okay, it's quite simple, easy, good. Let's go over. I don't want to talk about DDD in this comment. Let's go over with another comment. I created another business rule. This time, as you can see, in the code, I added another business rule. You don't only need a good average peer review, but also a minimum number of reviews to be promoted. So you need at least 4 reviews in order to proceed. So we have 2 invariants, 2 business rules in order to promote someone. I know that this code is quite stupid, okay? It's quite simple, but imagine now that you have a very, very large complex application where business rules are scattered in the UI component, like in this case. This is far from optimal, okay? And I want to solve this problem with DDD because we all know that the main purpose of DDD is to preserve the domain, to write testable domain. So let's start with this DDD refactoring. Okay, first thing first. As you can see here in my notes, I added another domain-driven design techniques, the services. A service is an object that orchestrates steps required to fulfill the commands imposed by the client. In this case, the client is the user, okay? So it's the clicks, okay, of the user. Okay, so the main difference right now is that I created an employee service and I use the employee service promote inside the app.js. Okay, so I have put all the business logic in a service. Oh, I lost my mouse, sorry, okay. Okay, let's take a look at employee service code. The employee service, like the definition says, orchestrate the steps between other elements of DDD. In this case, my repositories. So I have the 2 repositories. And when I click promote, I just take the element that I want to promote, all the employees that I need to update, and I have a callback. In this case, the callback is the set employee from React. And I will return on this particular point in a moment. As you can see, this code is completely identical from the previous version, but I put it in a different file outside from the UI. And this is quite good because I can test it unitarily because using React to test my code. There is something that is quite strange that we will solve later. We need the callback from React in order to pass information between my services and React. This is not ideal because the service is, should be independent from their infrastructure, from React. If I were in a React application, in an Angular application, in a Vue application, or also in an old backbone application, my service should not change. So this is quite an anti-pattern. This is a code smell, okay? But I will try to solve it in a moment. So let's go on. Okay, what I changed here is that I introduce also value objects and aggregate. And aggregates are the best way to how can I say, to preserve domain, to preserve invariants. So I created an aggregate. And before taking a look at the definition, I want to share with you the code before, okay? So my service is changed right now because I have an employee aggregate factory. I use the factory because I didn't want to use classes in this code, okay? So my service just take data from a repository. It creates an aggregate and then invoke the promote method of the aggregate. Then we take the results, and if the results is not changed, because the promoted is still false, so it's not true, then I will throw an error. Otherwise, I will continue with my flow. Let's take a look at the aggregate. Okay, first thing first, I use some utilities to create a freeze function that just take any object and return a frozen cloned version of that object. In JavaScript, when you froze an object and you try to update the object directly, you will get an error. It's a way to achieve full immutability without types, okay? You froze an object. So my factory takes the employee that I want to wrap, my entity, and I take the reviews that are all the reviews from that employee. So then I create the aggregate that is container for employee, so the entity, the ranking that is a value object that I will show you in a moment how this is created. And then I have the promote method. The promote method is it's the same business logic as before. And this time I decided that because this is an immutable object, every time that I click the promote, I invoke the promote, I create a clone of the old aggregate, okay? So I cannot modify it, I just create a copy. So if the ranking are too low, I don't have enough reviews, I will just clone myself without changing everything. Same thing if I don't have enough a lower vote, I just clone myself. Otherwise, I just change the employee promoted attributes by a copy. So I created a clone of the object, changing the attribute, and then I freeze it, and then I return it to the client. This is quite good because we isolated the objects, the application, the real application code in a pure JavaScript object without any kind of dependencies for my architecture about, okay, Lodash clone deep or deep freeze utilities, okay? They are not infrastructure, they're just utilities. Quite interesting is also the ranking value object. The ranking value object is just a representation of the list of reviews when I take the number and then take the average, and then I froze them together in an object. And this is what is called a value object, because if you take a look at the definition right now that we saw the code, so we have the aggregate is a cluster of domain objects, so entities or value objects. In this case, the value object is the ranking and the entity is the employee, that can be treated as a single unit. Their main purpose is to ensure that validity of business rules related to the domain. And this is my business rule. Because I froze the object, I cannot change my promoted attribute directly. I need to pass through a promote method. I know that if you come from Java, Kotlin, or C#, this is quite it seems simple stuff. But in JavaScript, it's not so simple because you don't have types, you don't have read-only properties. So you need to use meta-programming to achieve this particular stuff. So I used a froze object to don't let my consumer to change my properties directly. Okay, so let's go over. And let's go over with domain events. The last DDD technique that I want to show you today. A domain event is something that is relevant to the domain, and their name should be in past tense in order to communicate that something is already happening in the system. In this particular scenario, what I mean with domain events, I use domain events when I want to communicate with other part of my application that something has happened. For example, in this case, in my index right now, okay, it's just a simple, stupid listener. I have a subscriber to an event bus that just print a console log. But in a real world application, I can use the event bus, for example, to synchronize events between the client and the server. So imagine that you have a socket event bus on the server. For example, you can have Axios, you can have, also a custom implementation with Express, whatever you want. You can have Axon framework, okay? So you have something that is ready to accept events on the server. You can use this simple event bus to subscribe to an event from the client that generate a change on the UI to propagate this change with a simple payload on the server. This is a very, very powerful stuff from a front-end point of view. The event bus, it's quite simple. Okay, I have a list of subscribers. I have a subscribe method that just add a subscriber to the list. And I have a simple publish method that take a type and a payload, put them together, and then just launch the events on all the subscriber. Okay, so it's very stupid. The aggregate now take also as an input the event bus. And then when I have, a new aggregate, before returning it to my consumer, I publish an event to the event bus. In this way, I completely disaggregate the aggregate to the infrastructure, or not. This is just the first implementation, but it's far from perfect, because an aggregate should be a pure domain model, okay? You should not know about infrastructure and frameworks. But this is true not just with React or with other front-end framework, but it's also true with my own infrastructure. So the event bus should not know about event bus. Also, if event bus, it's my custom code because it's part of my infrastructure, and my model should be independent from the infrastructure. Okay, with the last commit now. This is the final implementation. So in order to don't have the event bus inside the aggregate, I created an array of events inside the aggregate, and I created a release events method. This is similar to a lot of Java framework about events, also PHP framework, CSS framework. It's quite similar, okay? Release events just return the events, but before returning them, it just clears the events, so I don't aggregate events one after the other. The only difference is that in the aggregate, I just push an event into the array, and in the service, I don't pass the event bus to the aggregate, but after the promote method, I just get all the events and I publish them to the event bus. That's it. With this simple mind shift, I maintain my aggregate as pure as possible. The last thing that I want to show you is my tests for the aggregate. I think that an aggregate is good enough when your test does not depend on the infrastructure. In my case, all the tests, for example, about immutability, I'm testing that my aggregates are immutable, that I cannot change the promoted attribute directly. Well, I think this is a good aggregate because its creation just depends from the input parameter without any kind of dependence injection. Because my aggregate should be as pure as possible. Let's take a quick look at the other tests. So I tested about the mutability. Then I test about the reviews. So it should return a not reviews error if there are less than 4 reviews. Okay. Then I tested the ranking too low. So I tested that if I have more than 4 reviews, but my ranking is lower than 7, I should have a ranking too low error. Or I should return a promoted employee when the conditions are valid. So if I have an high number of rankings and the average value is high enough, then I tested at the end that events should be returned, as you can see here. I promote the employee, I get the events. I should have 1 event of the type employee promoted. Then I call again release events, and this time the events are empty. This is all the code that I have to show you. It's I know that it's quite simple, but you know, it's putting all this stuff together. It's not so easy if you are never work with DDD in the front end. So why you should care? Why I think that this topic is quite important? Well, because the domain is the most valuable part of your software. So you should always protect them. You should always defend domain from framework. And while this is a concept that the backend developer understands at first glance, it's not so easy for a front-ender to get it sometimes. And this is most important for legacy code. It's very easy to introduce a principle inside an existing code base instead of frameworks. If you remember, I started my talk with talking about the backbone application where everything started. The first thing that I used DDD in the front end. Well, the client wanted us to introduce React, to introduce another application in the backbone application, because they wanted to use new code. But we objected, and we didn't introduce anything. We worked with just pure JavaScript in order to protect domain. After we protected the most important part of the application and test them with unitary testing, we started to introduce React because it's easier to introduce principle instead of frameworks. If you have to remember one thing from this talk, I want it to be this slide. And this is because what we created with this code, what I show you is simple, but simple does not mean easy. Simple, it's very, very difficult sometimes. And I really love this quote from Leonardo da Vinci that say that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I think that DDD is a way to achieve maximum simplicity, but it will be not easy. As a side note, we are hiring and flowing, and we are a remote company, so you can work whatever you want in Europe. And if you are interested in working with me or with my colleagues, just send an email to recruiting@flowing.it. We have a lot of open position about front-end, back-end, or cloud engineer, UX designer, and so on. Like Giancarlo said at the beginning of the talk, I have a free copy of my book that I will give it to you in Ticino space. But I also have prepared for you a discount for my book about decision making for software developer team, because I'm writing it right now, so I will. It's not ready yet, but you can start reading, because I think I'm almost at half the book, and you can get a 20% discount following this link in the next week. At last, if you're interested in domain driven for front-end, I'm also preparing a workshop about that, but I really need to have a feedback for interested people. So if you're interested in this topic, just follow the waiting list and we can talk about that. We can just share ideas about the contents. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much to you, Francesco. It was a really interesting topic, not so common, I have to say.
Yeah, I know.
But as you pointed out, actually, the developers maybe they are doing DDD on front end, and they don't know that they are doing DDD.
Sometimes it could
Sometimes.
happen. It could happen.
Okay, I see that we have some question. Maybe we could try to answer to them.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I'll start with the question from Giorgio. It is this one. How difficult is implement this design at the beginning is lower with a customer that look only at velocity?
Okay, this is a very interesting question. Well, in that particular case, I think that it's safe to assume that this approach could be introduced later in the project. What I mean is because, and this is happen most of the time on the front end, okay? When you are starting working on a product, you don't know exactly what the product had to do. And this is particularly important on the front end because your client is not a machine, so it's not a contract, it's the user. So you need to adapt your, how the application is working with time. So what I will suggest also to solve this problem is that you introduce these techniques after a while. As you saw in the talk, it's easier because it's easy to introduce that also after a while because it's simple JavaScript code. I didn't introduce any kind of library or so on. So at the beginning, you need velocity, and you also need a lot of adaptability and evolvability. So probably I will just stick with simple, React set state. This is a React application, okay? After a while, when you have more complex domain objects, sorry, not the objects, business rules, more complicated business rules, you can just create aggregate repository entities with time.
Okay, nice. And then Christian is asking to us if you could talk a bit about how the repository returns entities. But it became very tempting for the front-end developer to just reuse the same data structures returned by the infrastructure, therefore.
Yeah, okay. This is also what I did in my first commit, okay? In my first commit, I just returned a simple JSON object. This is an anemic model, okay? But what I usually do in this case is that I have an API, a file called, I don't know, I'm trying to remember, employee API.js that just call the API and returns the JSON. Then I have a repository that use the API and use also a mapping function that return an entity. What I usually do is that I create these entities as possible as immutable, okay? And I create specific method in the entities to update the some of the most important feature, okay? Properties. It's true that is tempting from the front-end developer, because they are not accustomed to immutability and into complex JavaScript object. But I hope that this talk will help in this journey with not creating a naming object. But when I have in a real world scenario, my repository used as a dependency from a pure HTTP client that just called an API and returns a JSON. So the JSON is not an entity. Then I use the repository to transform the JSON into an entity. It's the same thing that you do on the back end, because you have, I don't know, a result set from an ORM and you return an entity. Okay, it's that similar. A JSON is just raw data for me. It's not just JavaScript code. The problem in JavaScript is that any JSON, it's a valid JavaScript object. But if you mentally, you use it as a string, it's a raw data, then it comes natural after a while.
Okay, perfect. I don't know if we have any other question. I think no. In the meanwhile, I will thank again Francesco for being here. It was really a pleasure for us of the Ticino Software Craft. And I remember you that if you stay with us just in a couple of minutes, the time to close the live streaming, we can give you some lucky of you a free copy of the book of Francesco, and also a free license from JetBrains.
Okay, perfect. See you in Kumo Space then.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
So, bye. Thank you again. Bye bye.